We have the covenant with Abraham being given right now, with Jesus pre-incarnate coming to earth and agreeing to die in Isaac's place, agreeing to die in your place and in my place. Crucifixion of Jesus fulfilled the messianic covenant. It brought peace and blessings to the whole world, and then he was raised from the dead in the same way that Abraham believed and had faith that he would be, as the lamb to be slain with the crown of thorns. Amazing. This is typology. Woo! Okay. We are going to be talking about typology today, one of my favorite subjects in the Bible. And we're going to be going over both like what is typology and my personal favorite example of it, which is the binding of Isaac. So, what is typology? Typology is basically ways to show Jesus or some other future prediction in the Old Testament that God cleverly used to both help demonstrate his authorship of the Bible, but also his divine providence, that he planned things out intentionally. And we get, hundreds of examples of typology in the Old Testament. Whenever I go through Isaac, it's going to make a lot more sense like what I mean, but it's basically things that kind of look like Jesus or some other reality that exists. So there is technically a typology of Mary in the Old Testament, and there's typologies of the third temple. There's typology or specific just like prophecy about like the new heaven and the new earth. There's typology of maybe John the Baptist. Like you have typology not just of Christ, but the vast majority of them are of Christ. And it's basically it's a methodology to find connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because the Old Testament is not a complete book, but the New Testament makes it complete. There's a clear end and a clear beginning, and together they form one cohesive story. Well, typology helps us see the aspects of the ending from the beginning. It helps us understand who Jesus actually is, and in order to understand Jesus the most, in order to get the fullest picture of him possible, typology is one of the key pieces required in order to understand who Jesus is. So whenever I first taught this, offline, I titled the series Understanding Jesus. And I don't know if I'm going to title that in this series, but we're going to be going over typologies of Jesus in the Old Testament, starting with Isaac. Real quick, if you like this idea, if you like this content, please share it. It helps significantly for us to reach more people with the gospel message, with the truthfulness of the Bible. Liking, commenting helps as well, but sharing, subscribing would help significantly. Look at this graph. Back to the video. There's some rules of typology that we need to understand. First off, we're not going to create any new doctrines from typology. If you are creating some new aspect of our faith system purely based on typology and nothing else, that is probably guaranteed to be wrong. Let's not do that. Don't do that at all. That's not what we're doing here. It's the Black Panther meme. So, is typology legitimate? Well, the New Testament seems to think so. We have multiple instances of pretty much every author of the New Testament doing some form of typology, including Jesus himself. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. Here, Jesus is doing typology. He's showing, hey, there is this type, the bronze serpent, that those in the wilderness, whenever they looked at the bronze serpent, they were healed of their poison that was condemning them to death. Here we have anyone who sees the lifted up Messiah will be saved from their poison. So we have Jesus himself doing typology in the New Testament. We also have, in Romans 5, Paul also doing typology. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking the command, as did Adam, who is a pattern of the one to come. So this idea of a pattern, that is essentially typology. You are finding a pattern of what was to what will be. And sometimes these patterns are direct fulfillments, like the bronze serpent. Sometimes they're antitypes, like in Jonah, which we'll get to. We'll make our own video about Jonah. But the beginning of Jonah has an antitype where Jonah is called by Yahweh to go serve and save the Gentiles. Jesus is called by God the Father in order to save the world. So here, there, instead of being a direct fulfillment, Jesus is the opposite of it, or the greater aspect of it. So it's not just there's this point and that point and they agree. It's also the not necessarily so antitype is it's a technical term used to show like Jesus typically. So like the type in the Old Testament is fulfilled by the antitype in the New Testament. In a way, I like using the terminology antitype as to being the opposite of Jesus rather than it being Jesus, because Jesus is technically called the antitype the vast majority of the time. So I don't know a great terminology for this because it's still technically a type, but should it be like the opposite type or a negative type? I'm gonna use that terminology. So we're gonna use in this series, even though this is not like standard Christian practice, I'm gonna say a positive type and a negative type of Christ. Where a positive type is a type that is one-to-one with Jesus, and a negative type is the opposite. So someone failed where Jesus succeeds. So in Jonah, we see that Jonah is sent and he rejects the call. So where he rejects the call, Jesus accepts the call. So that would be a negative type of Christ versus the positive type of Christ. It would be way more sense in my brain whenever I actually talk about this to say type and antitype, but because that's not how the terminology is typically used, I think that would be more confusing than just coming up with new terms. So we're going to use new terms. That's essentially what I mean by typology. We have a couple more examples I want to point out in the New Testament. So in Hebrews 7, we also have this typology of Melchizedek. So this Melchizedek was king of Salem, which means peace, and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him, and Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, then also king of Salem means king of peace, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. Resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. So here we have, again, another type of Christ given through Melchizedek by the author of Hebrews. So we have plenty of times in the Bible where these types are used, and Hebrews 11 is essentially the Hall of Types. It's called the Hall of Faith by most translators, but it's really just a bunch of types of Christ. And we can see it if you go through all of Hebrews 11, you'll find type after type after type after type of Christ there. So this idea of typology, this idea of we can find traces of Jesus all throughout the Old Script, like the Old Testament, that is going to be foundational to this series. And let's go through the example for this video right now with the binding of Isaac. So we are going to read through the whole passage, and then I'm going to point out every single type as we go. So as I'm reading this, think in your head, hey, that could be a type. That sounds like Jesus. Do that. We'll get to the end of it. Then we'll go through. It's a surprising amount of types of Christ. Here we go. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife as the 2 of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father, "Abraham." "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar and there arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood, and then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," and to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Now, I'm sure that many of those caught your attention, thinking in the light of Jesus. I'm sure the ones that caught your attention the most are probably like the 3 days. That's an interesting one. And maybe the wood. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. Those are probably the ones that really popped out to your head, but there's so much more than that. So there is a test for Abraham. In the same way Jesus was tested in the wilderness, he was willing to lay down his life because of his obedience to the Father. Here, Abraham is willing to lay down his son's life to obedience to the Father. So you have this testing and obedience to God, the Father, that both men are showing. And he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love. So this only son can be loosely translated as the begotten son, or your only begotten son. John uses similar language in his gospel. So here we have your only son, whom you love, Isaac. And this is the first time this word is used in the Bible. This is the first time the word love appears in the Bible, and it's 22 chapters into it. The book that is focused so heavily on love takes 22 chapters in order to get to the word love. And it's so important here because this instance of love is the first one. So in this typology of Jesus, we have the Father loving the Son, and it is so important that God reserved it to be the first instance of it, which is amazing. Your only son is not true. Isaac is not his only son. He also has Ishmael at this point, and he'll have a bunch of kids after this point. He has like 6 other kids. But we have Isaac, and God is not necessarily lying, but he's emphasizing Isaac as the only son to emphasize Jesus as the only son who he loves. You know, the Trinity is in a eternal set of interpersonal loving relationships forever. Isaac can go to the region of Moriah. Moriah is interesting because Mount Moriah is the Temple Mount. So it is the place that Jesus was killed specifically. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. So he's going to be a sacrifice for sin on the Temple Mount. Okay. Early the next morning, Abraham got up, loaded his donkey, and took with him his 2 servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for a place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. So he travels there on a donkey. So, you know, Jesus enters into Jerusalem on a donkey. Here, Abraham is entering into the region of Jerusalem on a donkey with the wood of the offering. And on the 3rd day, it takes 3 days to complete this mission. Same thing with Jesus and his resurrection. We will worship and we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. So Jesus carried the cross. Isaac is carrying the wood on which he will be sacrificed on up this mountain, the same way that Jesus carried the post beam of the cross up this mountain 2,000 years later. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. The Father is the one who was responsible for killing the Son. He had the knife in his hand. He was the one that was directing all of it to happen. Because it was not the will of men that Jesus was crucified. It was the will of God that he was slain. As the 2 of the men went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Father Abraham, the wood and the fire are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? God himself will provide the lamb. Jesus Christ is the lamb to be slain. So here we have the Father providing the lamb in place of the Son, which is pretty cool. So where Isaac was replaced by the lamb, Jesus is the lamb to be slain. And the way it's shown is pretty awesome. Abraham built the altar and arranged the wood on it. He prepared the sacrifice of his son, and he bound his son Isaac and laid him on top of the wood. Well, this is interesting because Isaac at this point in time likely would have been a teenager or in his early 20s or something of that sort. The next chapter has him being 37. The chapter before that has him being born. So he's somewhere between a week old and 37 years old. Pretty wide time frame. But he was likely old enough to be stronger than his father. So this was not the father binding Isaac unwillingly, because Isaac probably could have just struggled. Instead, we have Isaac being laid down, likely on his own. So here we have Isaac being a willing sacrifice for sin, willingly being bound and placed onto the wood of the sacrifice that the Father created. The Father prepared ahead of time for this sacrifice to happen. Jesus, the cross of Christ, was prepared from before the universe was created because he knew it was a possibility of it happening. And in the same way, just as God knew the end from the beginning, he always knew that things would go to the cross because sin was probably inevitable. We have here that the father, Abraham, is building the altar. He's preparing the wood for the sacrifice of the son. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of Yahweh calls out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, so othering, because you have not withheld from me, your son, your only son. Again, not the only son. But here we have the angel of Yahweh. Well, this is, if you've seen my Angel of Yahweh video, if you haven't seen it, go check it out. If you haven't seen that video, like, we have an abundance of evidence to show that the angel of Yahweh is specifically Jesus. So this is Jesus in the Old Testament saying, no, Abraham, don't kill your son, who is being a type of Christ. So within this typology of Christ, we have Jesus himself pre-incarnate coming to stop the sacrifice. Then he said, don't do anything to him. I know you fear God. He's othering God because you've not withheld from me, your son, your only son. So now Jesus is saying, because you were willing to sacrifice your son for my purpose, my cause, my tests, like for not necessarily who I am, but like you were willing to honor me by sacrificing your son to me. In this same way, we have God, the Father, being willing to sacrifice God, the Son, in order to satisfy the righteous requirement of the law. We have, because Abraham was faithful, we have Jesus now saying, because you have not withheld from me, your son, your only son, he agrees to die on the cross. So this covenant is pretty amazing, because by the end of the covenant, we have again that the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares Yahweh, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you've obeyed me. Well, this blessing to the whole world is the Messiah. It is Jesus, and is Jesus' death on the cross to bring salvation into the world. So now we have Jesus pre-incarnate creating the covenant in which he will die to fulfill it and to enact the new covenant. We have the covenant with Abraham being given right now, with Jesus pre-incarnate coming to earth and agreeing to die in Isaac's place, agreeing to die in your place and in my place. So here we have Jesus making the messianic covenant with Abraham because of the sacrifice of Isaac. Because Jesus is faithful to keep his covenant because Abraham was faithful to keep his covenant. It gets even deeper. It gets so amazing because of the part I just skipped. So Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And it said to the day, on the mountain the Lord will be provided. This mountain is Mount Moriah. It is Calvary. It is the place Jesus died. 2,000 years later, Jesus dies on the same mountain. Maybe exactly to the day, 2,000 years later, because Abraham was right around that time period. We have 2,000 years later, Jesus being willingly put on the cross, brought up the mountain, and then dying for sin on the mountain of the Lord, and the Lord will provide. On Mount Moriah, on the Temple Mount, we have the Son being willingly bound on the wood, carrying the wood up the cross, laid on it, slain by the Father, in order for a blessing of the whole world to pour out on the mountain which is called the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide salvation. And the Lamb was a burnt offering in place of the Son. We have God and his righteousness, his goodness, replacing us and our sin and our deserving of wrath and destruction. Jesus took that on for himself. And this is one of the most amazing things in this passage. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket, he saw a ram caught by its horns. Well, a thicket is a thorn bush. So this is a ram, a young male lamb who had his horns. So he was, an early young adult. Human equivalent would have been 30 years old or so. We have a ram caught by its horns in a thicket of thorns. So this ram would have had a crown of thorns as it was sacrificed on the wood, on the mountain where the Lord will provide in the burnt offering to take away our sin, that the angel of Yahweh, Jesus himself, enacted to be a blessing to the whole world through the messianic covenant and the grace that was poured out by his blood. So here we have Jesus in the Old Testament as the lamb to be slain and as Isaac. It's two different objects that are representative of Jesus at this moment in time. And God uses that to show us his love. That even though he loves his one and only son so much, he is still willing to sacrifice him in order to bless the world. And this gets a little bit deeper with Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11:17 says, "By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death." God could even raise the dead. So when Abraham was sacrificing Isaac, he knew that the promises of the covenant that God made with him back in chapter 12 and reinforced in 16, he knew those promises that were then delivered in 18 and 19. He knew all of that in 21 was through Isaac. Yet he was still willing to slay him because he knew that even if he killed God, if God truly wanted it, God could raise the dead. And so the Son was raised back to life from the dead. Crucifixion of Jesus fulfilled the Messianic covenant. It brought peace and blessings to the whole world. And then he was raised from the dead in the same way that Abraham believed and had faith that he would be, as the lamb to be slain with the crown of thorns. Amazing. This is typology. We have many more to talk about in this series. May the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you always.